Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
Okay. Thank you, YouTubers, for showing up. We're getting ready to start the show. Stand by in 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
And this is the introduction to the show, Beyond the Matrix. I'm Rod Bryant along with Jerry Gordon. I want to thank the YouTubers for watching and making the show so popular. Thank you also for sharing the videos when you get an opportunity, and also subscribe right here in the corner so that we can see that you are part of the notification. Also, not only subscribe, but hit notification. So every time a show's posted, boom, you'll get notified. Today, we have a very important guest with us. We've had him on quite often from the JCPA in Jerusalem itself, Dan Diker. Jerry, give him a little bit of bio who Dan is.
All right, Dan is a director of the Program to Counter Political Warfare at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He's the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. He's the editor and co-author of a whole bunch of monographs published by the JCPA, the most recent of which was an article, The Alignment of BDS and Black Lives Matter, Implication for Israel and the Diaspora. Today's program is really stunning. We talk about two developments. The first is the normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel that has upset the Palestinian apple cart completely. Peace no longer goes through Jerusalem, it goes through the Sunni Muslim world. The second has to deal with a long-standing problem in the Balkans between Muslim Kosovo and Christian Serbia. And now we find, as a result of actions by former U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, and the Trump administration, recognition of Israel and Israel's capital by these two countries. It is a breakthrough.
Yes, it is. It's profound, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then what we're going to see, and we'll also discuss this in the show, is the probability of a domino effect taking place in the Mideast with the other Arab countries and Israel. So we have some great news for you. It's going to be a great show, so you don't want to go away. Also want to say that if you want to go to the website, jcpa.org, that is the website that Dan Diker has plenty of analysis on. We'd love you to go jcpa.org. And also want to thank those who watch on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. Really do appreciate it. We're going to go to a commercial break, and then after that, we'll jump right back into the questions. You don't want to miss this. This is also a good share show, so make sure you take time to share the video on your social media. We'll be right back after this. Okay, in 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And we are back with Dan Diker along with myself and Jerry Gordon. Really appreciate you guys tuning in, and also those who are watching on YouTube. We really, really do appreciate it. Right off the bat, Dan, I'd like to pick up this idea of the forthcoming consummation, basically, of the relationship between the UAE and Israel, called the Abraham Accord in Washington, has stunned most of the Sunni Muslim world and upset the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Why is this a game changer?
This is a stunning development, Rod, which very few people expected, except perhaps the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been working on this relationship behind the scenes very actively for 5 or 6 years. I'll remind us that for those Middle East watchers, that immediately after 9/11, Dubai turned to Israel for cybersecurity assistance because many of the Saudi attackers used Dubai as a way station to finance the 9/11 attacks. So there was a secret and growing mutual relationship between the United Arab Emirates and Israel beginning way back in just after 9/11, 2001. Subsequently, the two countries became closer, and there have been, as of 2011, $300 million of high-tech exchange. So this has been a relationship in the making. It's been one that has waited for the Iranian threat to be so prescient and so acute towards the Sunni Arab establishment, never mind Israel, that those Arab states are now really publicly seeking this normalization, with Israel beginning with the UAE. And clearly, the second point here is that the COVID-19 pandemic has sharpened that need even more, because one of the initial normalization agreements between the UAE and Israel has been research and development to find a cure and a vaccine for COVID-19. Just moving over to the Palestinian Authority for a moment, this agreement has pulled the propaganda machine out from under the Palestinian Authority leadership, who has for years defamed, delegitimized, and dehumanized Israel using the UAE and other Arab Sunni states as a cover to say there will never be peace in the Middle East unless the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, gets exactly what it wants out of Israel, and they would keep up this virulent anti-Semitic terrorism supporting campaign until they got what they wanted. Well, the UAE completely dismantled in real time that propaganda machine, and it has thrown the Palestinian leadership for a loop.
Doesn't it seem that there's going to be, or the potential of a domino effect in the Arab states around to end up doing something like the same thing the UAE did?
Well, I think yes, Rod. I think that you and Jerry, who are professional Middle East watchers, are well aware that let's go back just for a moment to the very skilled Jared Kushner, who even though he was an amateur in terms of his foreign policy experience, he understood after a lot of research between 216 and a half, 217, 218, that the way to get the Middle East into alignment with Israel and the United States is to begin with the Arab states, and in normalizing relations with the Arab states, knowing full well that the Iranian threat was the common enemy that really threatened the entire region. And once that threat was taken care of, then it would be much easier to address the Palestinian issue. Now, Jared Kushner and Mr. Attorney Greenblatt, Jason Greenblatt, together with David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, put together this really well thought out economic workshop in Manama in Bahrain in May 2019 as a pathway to success with some of these Middle Eastern countries. And in fact, one of the only players that didn't show up was the Palestinian Authority. And that sort of went according to plan. But all of a sudden, a year and a little bit later, you have talks of Bahrain joining the UAE, of Oman joining the UAE, of possibly Sudan joining the UAE, and tighten your seatbelt or fasten your seatbelt, maybe even the Saudis. Because remember, Jared Kushner's really close relationship was with who was known as MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who was very much behind a lot of these moves towards normalization, or certainly towards not full normalization, but let's call it amenability to Israel and accepting Israel as a member of the of the Middle East. This is I cannot overstate the extraordinary development here with these states. And I think we will see in the coming weeks another state, and maybe even the Saudis, who want Donald Trump to be reelected more than half of the United States, for sure.
Wow, that's a very profound statement. Jerry, go ahead.
What's been the impact of this stunning announcement, frankly, on a subject that's very close to you and your group, the normalization of Palestinians and Israeli Arabs?
Well, that's a key question, Jerry, because as you know, I wrote a book, a compendium called Defeating Denormalization, which is the inverse of saying advancing normalization. I spoke about it on your show about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And here you have the UAE, advancing regional normalization, when the three of us were talking about, very narrow sense of normalization between Israel and West Bank Palestinians and the Israeli Arab community. Well, so here we have it. The UAE deal really sets the new standard for the acceptability of normalization between Israel and the Palestinian middle and upper classes, and there are such things in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as well as the bazaar in Gaza, which is suffering. The middle class in Gaza is suffering terribly from their Hamas overlords that are being financed and backed by Iran and financed by Qatar. Qatar is trying to play, the sort of this mediating influence right now in Gaza. But clearly, the UAE deal has also strengthened the Israeli-Arab quiet understanding that normalization and socioeconomic cooperation, in Israel and between Israel and the Palestinians is the way to go.
Having said that, I noticed that the PA is rushing off to a meeting in the short distance with a resolution trying to corral all 22 members to support this hoary doctrine of peace goes through where, Jerusalem. What do you think?
That's true. That's true, Jerry. And you know what that's been met with? Thunderous silence on the part of the Arab League. The Palestinian Authority today are the bastard children of the Sunni Arab establishment. They if you look on the internet, Saab Arikat, the overpaid, corrupt minister of Soviet propaganda of the Palestinian Authority, somebody who was a very skilled negotiator 25 years ago and has subsequently become a master propagandist, dehumanizing, delegitimizing its peace partner Israel, and in fact they're now being themselves delegitimized, which they deserve, by fellow Arab countries. I mean, the language that they're using about the UAE is absolutely atrocious. They're calling the UAE the new Arab Zionists, that Israel has now occupied the UAE as opposed to the West Bank, referring to Israel's concession of its intention to apply Israeli civilian law to parts of the West Bank where Jews live, as well as Jordan Valley. But their language really makes them look like pathetic, withering leaves on what is otherwise an emerging evergreen region, in which Israel and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the other 5 Emirates are now exploring billions of dollars of health cooperation, agricultural cooperation, water desalinization, defense cooperation, you name it. And this is the new Middle East that even Shimon Peres never dreamed of.
This is profound. And I remember having the conversation with you a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, about your book. and how I was at some level holding on to the concept of, wow, if we could only see normalization come to this little part of Israel and the West Bank, right? And then now, a year later, we're looking at the potential of normalization with all the Arab nations. It's very profound to me, and it's news that has to get out and let people know that we do believe that peace can come through prosperity and normalization of a relationship. Absolutely. Hey, guys, don't go away. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. We have Dan Diker with us, along with Jerry Gordon. And guys, we'll be back right after this short message. Okay,
so
guys.
ask her, so where's your son going to end up when he completes his military training?
Well, God willing, he's in one of the best units. He's in 669, which is the elite Air Force unit, rescue unit. So I'm hoping that he'll stay right here in Israel, because you can get a good education in Israel at Bar Ilan, or you can get education at the IDC Herzliya. That's a good university, or at Ariel University. You can get a good education here.
Oh, most definitely. If you want to produce a leftist, send him to the United States.
Exactly.
By the way,
except the University of Chicago. University of Chicago, you can still get a good education.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm doing that survey. That's interesting.
Okay.
Okay, stand by, guys. 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Really appreciate you guys sticking around and watching us also on YouTube. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. And we have our very beloved guest, Dan Diker, great analyst, great information. We're discussing the normalization, basically, of the relationship between the UAE and Israel. But we've also been examining and heard some good input from you, Dan, about the fact that this normalization could spread to other countries, so which would be quite amazing. Jerry, go ahead. You had a question you wanted to ask.
Dan, before the break, you mentioned a renowned negotiator for the Palestinians, Saeb Erekat. It turns out that he's going to be involved with a program at your alma mater, Harvard University, regarding development of diplomats. And given what we know about Erekat's track record in terms of negotiating peace between the PA and Israel, isn't that a problem?
Well, Jerry, I think it really is a problem. I think that Harvard is really stuck. Harvard, one of the bastions of liberal education, I think on this issue of the Middle East and specifically Israel, has allowed itself to be dragged, into a cesspool of radicalism, especially when it comes to somebody like Saeb Erekat, who started as, a very well-heeled, a well-educated negotiator back in Oslo in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and he's simply become a master propagandist. There isn't an adjective from genocidal to racist to apartheid that Saeb Erekat hasn't spewed in order to characterize the Jewish and democratic state, his peace partner, in order to defame, dehumanize, delegitimize, the state of Israel. And the fact that Harvard University would actually pay such a person to come and quote unquote mentor students would be tantamount to Osama bin Laden or Assad or Omar Barghouti, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon, to mentor students. It's the same. They have the same approach to Israel. Right. His goal is to dehumanize and delegitimize Israel's right to exist, and he thinks that that's called pro-Palestinian. And unfortunately, there are certain people that fund these programs that are unaware of Erekat's extreme and hateful Jew hatred. And they call it, in the name of academic freedom, to have such a person. By the way, such a person, he can't even get in. The State Department won't let him in to the United States, so he has to do it by Zoom. But I truly hope that Harvard wakes up in the same way that they wouldn't have the Ku Klux Klan come in and counsel white students, about relations with Black Americans. They should not have Dr. Saeb Erekat mentoring students about relationships between Palestinians and Israelis.
I tell you, the metaphor that you've used with using certain elements of society, especially the KKK, teaching about race relationships between whites and blacks, it's so ludicrous but obvious at the same time that something should be done about it. Let me ask you this real quick. How significant, first of all, Jerry, in that line of thought, have you finished your questioning?
I did.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to ask, shift just a little bit. And part of this whole sort of shift of normalization in the Mideast, how significant was the granting of the air rights by Saudi Arabia and Bahrain for the U.S. and Israeli delegations to travel to Dubai?
Well, clearly that was a major step in the right, in the right direction in terms of perhaps full normalization with the Saudis. Again, what I sort of threw out before the break is that remember when President Obama ended up being a huge disappointment to the Arab states because he, on the one hand, mishandled the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and more importantly, he mishandled the Iranian issue, the JCPOA, which for the Arab world was a direct threat to their, to them, was an existential threat to them by protecting the Iranian regime. The former president ended up giving, well over $1 billion in Western currencies on slats that he sent to allow the Iranians to sabotage these countries. And so they fear, by the way, Rod, these countries led by the Saudis fear that a Biden presidency, a Biden-Harris administration that has already promised to go back to the JCPOA might put them in dire jeopardy. And that's why the Saudis will do everything they can in order to normalize relations with Israel so that they can allow Israel to protect them against the Iranian regime. Because remember, Israel has the capability, the weaponry, the technology, the know-how, and the political will to fight the Iranians. It's the only country that has continued to fight the Iranian regime and their proxies in Syria and Lebanon, and the Arab world knows that, and that's why you're seeing now the operationalization publicly of an Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran.
And how is the potential U.S. UAE sales of the F-35?
Well, Jerry, as you asked that question, there is a real sort of dramatic internal discussion going on about that particular issue. We're very aware of the New York Times story that came out just the other day, claiming that Netanyahu knew about the F-35 sale before the announcement of the UAE deal with Israel. Look, it's very clear to those that have watched Israel in the Middle East that Israel's QME, their qualitative military edge, is the national security term, which was guaranteed by the United States for decades, that would continue, and that we simply don't know what happened in the negotiating room with Mr. Netanyahu. But what has happened subsequently is that there is wall-to-wall agreement that this could be a problem for Israel. But let's bear in mind that there are different kinds of F-35s, just like there are different models of Volvos, or any other car, and that Israel's QME will be maintained, and that the Israeli trainers and military planners will be in very close touch with the UAE and monitoring that situation very, very closely, so that Israel obviously is not going to score what's known in Israel as a self goal, which means in English, shooting itself in the head over a normalization agreement with the UAE. So I'm sure that the UAE and Israel will work this out. I will mention that in recent reports in the last day or two I've read, UAE officials have simply said to the Israelis, stop talking about it. Stop talking about it, which means that they understand, I think, the sensitivity. And I'm sure that that will all be worked out as we move forward with our new Arab peace partners.
Point of information. This past spring, before the COVID closed down everything, I was in the company of both an Israeli F-35 pilot and a UAE pilot schmoozing at an outdoor restaurant here in Pensacola. So the kind of things that we're concerned about, you know, has passed the bar at this very moment.
Right.
Look, also this helps to sort of feather the bed a bit for the UAE to realize that they're giving a nod, or have been given a nod from the West to say, okay, let's make this deal sweet for you. I think the other nations are going to turn around and see that they're going to be missing out if they don't get involved with what's happening with the normalization itself. Jerry, go ahead.
Well, the other,
Dan,
Rod,
there was another.
wait one second. Let me jump in here, Rod. I just want to footnote and add to your comment here. The fear, though, in Israel and perhaps in the United States is that if an F-35 deal is somehow consummated with the UAE, it will set a precedent for other Arab demands for other Arab countries on weapon systems that could chip away at Israel's qualitative military edge. That is a real concern. And you know, for example, that once Israel agreed to return the Sinai to Egypt, you know, there was no, you know, Syria wouldn't settle for anything but 100%. The Palestinians wouldn't settle for anything but 100%. The Jordanians did settle for a lot less than 100%. But, you know, in the Arab world, when there's a precedent set, you can bet that nobody's going to want to get 1% less, or, you know, than the last guy.
Yeah, it's the whole proverbial thing that says if you give them an inch, they want a mile. So the whole point is you got to be careful what you bargain with. I really appreciate that. We're getting ready to go into a break, so we don't want to be able to miss anything. By the way, could you let people know how they can get a hold of your organization, or to be able to do some reading on what your organization does?
Absolutely, and thanks for that, Rod. We're really delighted, first of all, for listeners and viewers to take our very fresh and daily updates on briefs and analyses, including myself and my colleagues who are former diplomats and senior officials, senior military officials. It's jcpa.org. That's the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I'd be delighted if people would follow me at Dan Diker 84. That's my Twitter handle. You know, we're commenting on all of these issues all the time, every day. You know, we're really literally publishing things every day at the Jerusalem Center on exactly these issues, Middle East, Israel, and the world.
That's why I wanted to get it out. Hey, guys, we'll be right back after these messages. Okay, stand by.
And I'd like to shift gears in the third segment and deal with this stunning development that occurred last Friday at the White House by former U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Brunel.
Sure. Did you send that to me today, right? Was that last week?
Yeah, that was last Friday.
Yeah, that was really something. I forwarded that to some people.
I'm in the dark on that one.
Well, basically, it had to do with the nature of a kind of interesting deal between the breakaway Serbian province that is largely Albanian Muslims, called Kosovo. And,
Kosovo.
Well, depending where you go, Kosovo. And Serbia itself. And that included diplomatic recognition by Israel of one of the first European Muslim countries, meaning Kosovo. And to a second extent, it also provides an interesting entree for Serbia, which had previously, probably even currently, fallen back into the Russian sphere.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a big development because that was clearly the leftover of the Balkan the murderous Balkan
That's
War.
correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And the Serbs were sort of the sworn enemies of the Kosovars, the Christian Serbs and the Muslim Kosovars. I actually wrote a very hard-hitting piece back in 2010 that was sort of a watershed moment in the Palestinian-driven defamation and delegitimization movement against Israel, because we had seen that the Palestinians were quoting the Kosovars back in 2010 regarding the Kosovo's February 2008 unilateral secession from Serbia and their demand for international recognition for independence. And it got very messy. And Israel actually didn't want to get involved. So even though the Kosovars which is 80% Muslim, they wanted Israeli recognition, and they've been willing to recognize Israel's capital, but Israel didn't play. And now all of a sudden you've got Richard Grenell, the very talented former ambassador to Germany and former acting director of national intelligence, being the special envoy towards that issue. It can be, a real development for Israel, because apparently the Kosovars and the Serbs are ready to sign on. Kosovo and the Serbia are ready to sign on to recognition of Israel's capital, Jerusalem.
Correct.
That is.
So keep that thought and that dialogue, and I'll pop that question to you when we come out.
That was good. Okay, here we go. Cue up. 3, 2, and 1.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
We are in the final leg of the show, Beyond the Matrix. I'm Rod Bryant, Jerry Gordon, and Dan Diker from the JCPA, and you can look them up, jcpa.org. Jerry, go ahead.
Dan, there was another stunning diplomatic development, and that occurred in Washington last Friday, as it turned out, in an announcement by former U.S. Ambassador to Germany and former interim Director of National Intelligence, Richard Grenell. He's a pretty talented guy. Something concerning diplomatic recognition of Kosovo and Serbia, and also the movement of their embassies to Jerusalem. How significant is that?
Well, it really is. It's really a bombshell announcement, Jerry, because those of us who are old enough, I know you guys aren't old enough to remember back in the 1990s in the Balkan War. How much do you love me for that statement?
We'll put it
on Beyond the Matrix.
There'll be
the three of us, and what's that, Rod?
There'll be a check in the mail.
Thank you very much. Just make sure there are a lot of zeros there. And I think many of our listeners and viewers here will remember the horror of the Balkan War and Serbia and
right.
The murder of thousands of Kosovars as a member at the hands of the Serbs, and also the murder of Serbs. It was just a horrible Holocaust-like ethnic cleansing situation in the Balkans. And back in which was resolved, of course, through the tremendous efforts of Richard Holbrooke, of blessed memory, a great American diplomat. And then what ended up happening subsequently is that after years, is that we noticed in the Middle East that the Palestinian Authority was looking at Kosovo, which in February 2008 announced its unilateral push for statehood and asked that the UN submit Muslim majority Kosovo push for unilateral statehood to the International Court of Justice, away from which is the legal arm of the UN. And what we noticed, though, in Israel is that the Palestinian Authority was modeling its own, sorry to say, but total violation of the Oslo interim accords, they were modeling it after Kosovo. If you remember, Salam Fayyad was the erstwhile Palestinian Authority prime minister for some time, even though he was kicked out because he wasn't a Fatah member. He used and Yasser Abed Rabo, they used the Kosovo unilateral push for statehood model, and they wanted to apply it to the Palestinian case in total violation of Oslo. This frightened Israeli diplomats and government officials, so Israel never recognized Kosovo, even though Kosovo was always friendly to Israel, protected its Jewish minority during World War II, allowed the 100 or so Jews there to live freely as Jews. And recently, Jerry, as you just mentioned, there has been this extraordinary, stunning development where both Muslim majority Kosovo and Christian Serbia have mentioned their readiness to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital in order to get the reciprocal recognition from Israel, certainly on the Kosovo part, for Kosovo. I think if you dig a little bit deeper into this sort of complex story, the Serbs had backed the Palestinian Authority in their 2012 quest for unilateral UN support for UN sanction for a Palestinian statehood, and that sort of annoyed the Israelis. But nonetheless, the Israelis still did not support the Kosovars, which you thought they would. Back in 2019, just a year ago, the Kosovars sent a senior official here to Israel. It was a very friendly trip. It was part of the American Jewish Committee's program, and therefore I think that recently we've seen some very positive developments. And here you have both Christian Serbia and Muslim majority Kosovo recognizing Jerusalem and recognizing one another, by the way. This is the first time that they've agreed on economic normalization. So this is a win-win all around, and I think that President Trump, frankly, deserves a lot of credit on this. He's a real deal maker. Say what you want to say about his Twitter habits and his personal style, which is up for, or controversial to say the least. But he knows how to make deals, and he's been doing it in the Middle East, and now he's doing it with these former European enemies.
Just a quick question. What do you think that Israel's consternation in the whole Kosovo recognition, what was behind that pushback on that?
Well, as I said before, Israel was very suspect that if it recognized Kosovo, that it would trigger other separatist movements, just like in Spain with the Catalonians, as well as in with Turkey, with Morocco, and in Western Sahara, also with China and Tibet. In other words, it would trigger separatist movements, and then the Palestinians would just sort of latch on to those movements, and it would put a lot of international pressure on Israel. So Israel didn't want to jump on that Balkan bandwagon.
Yeah, makes sense. Gary, go ahead.
Dan, Hamas and Hezbollah have held meetings seeking to expand terrorist activities in the region against Israel, despite the recent Beirut port blast that devastated Lebanon. What policies do you think the U.S. and Israel should undertake about Lebanon to address this threat?
Well, Israel's policy towards Lebanon has been one of Lebanese central government, you are responsible for terrorist or insurgent actions that take place in your country and towards our country. And so this has been a policy of what they call sovereign responsibility, not absolving Lebanon, even though one can argue it's a failed state that today is controlled by the Iranian regime and the Hezbollah proxy everywhere from central and from the middle of Beirut in the Dakhia neighborhood in Beirut all the way south. So one is called sovereign responsibility, and making sure that the official government actors in Beirut are put on notice that they're not being given a free pass. Number one. Number two, is exactly what Israel's doing right now, which is coalescing Arab partners in advance of any possible action against Iran and its proxies. Let's remember, Iran has proxies in almost every country, from Iraq to Syria, across to Lebanon, down to Gaza, in Yemen, with the Houthis. So it has done a fairly effective job in subverting almost nearly every Arab country, in the region, and it's also working North Africa as well. So, but Israel is building coalitions, and I think I think that is one of the major outcomes of the UAE Israel. It puts the Iranians on notice. This is a major blow to the Iranian regime, because remember, Iran is also surrounded by Arab countries as well as Azerbaijan. And so, wherever there is a friendly Arab country, you better watch out, because Israel's going to be there on the ground. And this completely changes the balance of power between Israel and the Iranian regime. And I think the mullahs are adjusting their senior diapers and shaking in their boots.
I want to ask you this question. We know that Israel's been working on these relationships for many years, and we're just now seeing the fruit of that and actually getting knowledge of it. How long do you think Israel's been working behind the scenes, either through diplomatic sources or the Mossad, whatever? How long do you think they've been doing this in the background?
You mean with Arab countries in the Middle East?
Countries, yes, yes, Sudan, etc.
Well, Israel has had relationships with countries like in the Red Sea area, like Eritrea, Southern Sudan, for years. Secret relationships, and people know this. This is public record stuff. Again, after 9/11, we started to see some of those defense, mutual interest in defense begin to bear fruit. I will say that Prime Minister Netanyahu, has always believed that the way to bring peace to the Middle East is to begin from the outside in, not with the Palestinians moving outwards, but with the Arab states moving inwards. And his view has always been that Israel should reach out to Muslim-majority countries. He dispatched Ambassador Dr. Dori Gold, who's the president of the Jerusalem Center, when Ambassador Gold was a special envoy. He was also Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, 2015-16. He was dispatched to countries like, dispatched more accurately, to countries like Chad and other Muslim majority countries in Africa, and as well as to the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries. So this Prime Minister Netanyahu really deserves a lot of credit. He has worked behind the scenes. He's been prime minister for 11 years, and he's done a lot of regional work. And that regional work has borne fruit, much to the dismay of the Palestinians, but much to the, I would say, celebration of the rest of the region. And it will turn out that if the Europeans sort of get with the program and understand that there is a new Middle East, they'll have to sort of admit that they were dead wrong on the Palestinian issue. But hopefully, the Eastern European republics will help the Western European republics understand the reality that we're living in the Middle East.
When you see the actual product that is being laid out with some of these Arab countries and Israel, it won't take long before the propaganda that's thrown out about how Israel is such horrible terrorists, they're vicious, they're going to take over the Arab nations, et cetera, and then to find out, no, they're the actual nice guys on the block. It sure changes the whole paradigm of what is to be talked about. We are completely out of time. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to check out the website, jcpa.org, and we'll see you sometime next week at the same time. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Okay.
From Jerusalem.
Highly informative program.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent discussion.
Yep. Dan,
Rod, what makes sense, I've seen this done. If you can clip like 2.5-minute segments that just stand on their own,
Yeah.
You get a lot of views. People love watching 2.5 minute thing, making a point. You can lead up with it with a point. You can talk about Israel's, is Israel the problem or the solution in the Middle East? Here, Dan Diker, a Middle East analyst, and then you just play that little segment.
I'll do it. I think,
and then you can say, click to listen to the full show. You can use them as teasers.
yes, I'll do that. I'll do it. Great idea. I really appreciate you mentioning it. I don't know why I didn't think about that, but you're correct.
So Dan, the question is, we've got two interesting developments, the one with the UAE, obviously, and putting the PA in the box. But the complex story that we talked about in the second segment is really remarkable.
It's remarkable. We remember the Balkans. It was mamish a Holocaust.
Yeah.
And
here you have Trump. Trump did it. He dispatched the people and he did it. And Grinnell is amazing. And these assholes, these journalist assholes start asking him about gay rights. I mean, are they crazy?
Well, that's what
them a new asshole, and I'm happy he did it.
Well,
I think he was too calm.
You saw what he